Welcome to Spiritual Psychology. My name is Renee McKenna, and I bring my 30-plus years as a recovering addict and ex-crazy person turned therapist and shamanic healer to bring you snackable teachings on spirituality, psychology, and all things personal growth. And today I want to talk about birth and death, and the idea that these two events, which every human will experience, are perhaps some of the most formative experiences of our entire life when viewed from a soul level. And a soul level perspective is this meta or really wide angle perspective on a human life and the overall development or devolvement of a person over their lifetime. Because of my work in spiritual psychology with many clients over the years, it has become very clear that the circumstances and birth experience can have tremendous impact, even be like a template for a person's body, mind, spirit, emotions, relationship complex. And we are ridiculously complex, incomprehensibly so. There are so many moving parts and contributing factors: physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, environmental, ancestral, societal, cultural, genetic, continually evolving and transpiring. We are in a perpetual state of development, whether we're aware of it or not. There seems to be a lot of evidence that this development continues across lifetimes. I don't have a strong opinion on that, and that's up for you to decide, but not infrequently I come on past life experiences of people, particularly at the moment of their death or some extreme trauma in a past life that is reiterating itself in this lifetime. That's how I use the term karmic issues, patterns of experience or behavior that repeat in slightly different forms within a lifetime. And if we don't evolve out of those patterns, and karmic patterns usually involve suffering, so we want to evolve out of them, then it seems like we may drag them into the next lifetime with us until we get the message. The message being evolution of consciousness from my perspective, moving from suffering, power imbalances, and isolation into the unification of joy, love, and experience of the connected oneness of all things. I try to head in that direction. I doubt I'm going to get there in this lifetime, but you never know. Got a few decades left as an adamant joy and love connection seeker and a now suffering avoidant. I've had my times being kind of addicted to suffering in my own karmic patterns. And those karmic patterns have primarily showed up in intimate relationship for me. And the most painful ones could be traced back to my birth experience. Before I talk about my own birth circumstances and that of some of my clients and how it's affected their lives, I want to mention the work of Stan Groff, which is where I first learned about birth trauma. And he's a psychiatrist who did a lot of powerful and groundbreaking experiments with psychedelics in the 50s before they became illegal. And when they weren't allowed to use psychedelics anymore, Stan developed holotropic breath work as a tool to access the deeper realms that psychedelics make available chemically. And it is my therapeutic experience that those realms of experience, the more non-rational body felt, emotional, energetic experiences, are really easily accessible through guided imagery, body-centered meditation, light hypnotherapy, and the shamanic journey. So there's lots of different tools that will get you there. Psychedelics are very hip right now. The problem I see with working with psychedelics that can absolutely give you a ton of information is that most of it remains unintegrated. There's the facilitation of kind of a peak experience and very little support or understanding of how to unpack that and integrate it into ordinary life for our own development. One of my mentees is working diligently to become a psychedelic facilitator, particularly with this perspective of integration as one of the central offerings they want to provide. Holotropic breath workshops are still being held, and Stan Groff is still teaching and has a ton of books if you want to do a little deeper dive into his really deep and interesting perspective on psychology and human development. And birth trauma for both the mother and the child in our culture is really under-recognized for the enormity of the issue that it is in most psychological and even medical modalities. I'll do another show on birth trauma for the mother. That's a whole other conversation. Because birth and death are two of the most intense experiences that we will have as a human. And it's very interesting that in modern life, we spend a lot of energy medicating those, which has its own implications for our soul development. So birth circumstances are one of the major players in this constantly moving kaleidoscope that makes up an individual person. You remember those old-fashioned kaleidoscopes? If you've ever seen one of the Victorian ones, they're amazing, filled with usually beautifully colored glass. And as you move it, the glass pieces are constantly falling into different shapes, making a completely different picture. And that's kind of how I view each human. I've never met two that were the same. I think there are literally millions of components that go into making each little individual unit of consciousness that we are. And from my perspective, this isn't about blame or figuring out why. When we look at our birth circumstances and understand how they may have affected us on an emotional, psychological, relational, or even physical level, then we can work with those causes in present time. They may hold the keys to some of the locks on the karmic patterns that we're stuck in. I did a podcast on karma and family of origin, number 48, if that's of interest. And when I talk about birth circumstances, I'm not just talking about the actual moving through the birth canal or C-section experience. The womb experience and even conception itself is part of that process. One of my early clients was the product of a rape. She didn't find that out until she was an adult. The man she thought was her father was the father of her 4 siblings, but he married her mother and they went and got her out of an orphanage, which still existed at that time, when she was about 18 months old. And apparently her mother's genetics were fairly strong because all the kids looked alike. And much later in her life, the story came out in a discussion with her aunt. My client's mother was developmentally delayed. She was actually pretty violent and abusive as well, but she was a little off. And her aunt told her that her mother had always been slow and that she had been kept home a lot because they didn't trust that she could care for herself out in the world. And after she graduated high school, she got her first little job and she went out after work. This is my client's mother. And she went out after work and had some drinks. And she got drunk because she had never drank before. And she had sex with a sailor. It was a one-night stand or a rape. We'll never know because her mother was probably in a blackout. But she'd told her sister it was a rape. And she got pregnant. And 9 months later, my client was born and immediately handed over to the adoption people in the hospital. And although the physical birth experience was uncomplicated, the emotional and psychological environment of the womb and the post-birth experience was horrific. My client's mother resented the pregnancy and this unwanted child. In fact, she didn't realize she was pregnant until she was like 6 months pregnant because she was a little slow. She thought she was getting fat. And it was her sister who asked her if she had been getting her period, and she said no. And they went to the doctors, and she was entering her 3rd trimester. Horrified, very Christian family, tons of shame, and she quickly had the baby, tried to put it out of her mind as soon as she could. And my client had a lifelong battle with addiction, alcoholism, and some pretty extreme sexual and relational issues. She usually ended up with men that were obsessed with her. She was quite beautiful and frequently picked men who were straight up kind of ugly and creepy and even weird. But they were obsessed with her. They would never leave her. So there was some powerful security there for her. But then she would alternate between relationships with men who were more in her league, we could say, intellectually. But those men were often sexually violent with her. In fact, she herself was raped. It was a date rape on the first date with this guy. And she got pregnant. She did not have the child. The implications of the repetitions of karma are profound and mysterious. I did some very intense work with that client around her birth experience and the immediate separation from her mother, who didn't even want to hold her. In fact, in those days, women were often completely sedated during childbirth, and she had no interaction with her birth mother at all until she was 18 months old when they came and got her. And in spiritual psychology, again using the shamanic journey or guided inner journeys, which look like guided visualization. We are able to travel across historic and psychological time and connect with these aspects of ourself in present time. That birth trauma, really any trauma in our life, is trauma because it becomes a template for how we treat ourselves in the world, or what we expect. Creates an inner wound that doesn't really heal, usually below the level of consciousness, continues to drive our behavior, our choices, our beliefs about ourselves and our expectations of the world, and those have profound implications for our life experience. Because our beliefs, our perspectives, and the choices we make really do determine the quality of our life. And so the work of healing birth trauma is to connect with higher consciousness, our own best adult self, aspects of God, nature, guides and teachers, ancestors. However, the individual practitioner connects with the very healing and compassionate elements of higher consciousness, and to connect with those traumatized aspects of ourselves, not to re-experience them, but to actually retrieve those aspects of ourselves, such as the unwanted fetus, the abandoned infant, or a baby traumatized by the birth experience itself, which is incredibly intense and a life and death experience. Many babies die in childbirth, and many mothers as well. Birth is no joke. Having done it twice, and if it wasn't for modern medicine, both myself and my first child would be dead for sure. I had a C-section for a labor that wouldn't progress. My baby's cord was wrapped around his neck, and again, if it wasn't for modern medicine, ultimately he probably would have died and me with him. But that's not what happened, and he, like myself, was born C-section, which is its whole own karmic repetition, although a very positive and healing one. But we went back to the birth circumstances with my client, to the abandoned infant after birth, and brought her adult self to connect with this abandoned child aspect of her own psyche, and she wanted nothing to do with the baby. In the inner journey, at first she tried to make nice, but the abandoned aspect of herself wouldn't have it. Knew she was full of crap. An inner distrust. It's one of the powerful things about inner journey work. It really reveals the deeper truths that need to be healed. And I tried my best to get her together with that baby so that she could really stop abandoning herself, because that was the template that had been set for her. That the abandonment of her birth experience, the abandonment actually of her conception of being unwanted, unrecognized, completely denied really for the first 2 years of her existence, that echoed throughout her life between needing to be obsessed upon or abandoned, harmed, or unconscious through her use of drugs and alcohol. And so she refused to connect with that abandoned aspect of herself. And we did bring some light and some higher consciousness into the scene. It came in the form of Jesus. She was raised fundamentalist Christian. And we left Jesus with the baby. And that was the last session I ever had with that client. The willingness to take responsibility and to actually care for ourselves, and the openness to develop the skills and ability to do that is central to personal growth work. And I believe to transforming these deeper patterns. And so in my own inner explorations around my birth experience, I was totally a wanted child, but my mother was terribly anxious and unsupported. She met my father in November of 1963. They got married in April of 1964, and she got pregnant 3 months later. My mother had been divorced from a bad first marriage, not unlike myself, and had a civil ceremony with my father. They got married at lunchtime in Washington, D.C., in a courthouse. And my father's very Catholic family was horrified. First, that he didn't have a church wedding. Second, that they weren't invited. And third, that he married a divorcee, a fallen woman. In fact, when my father brought my mother up to meet his family, his younger brother, Arnold, who everybody called Red, because he had bright red hair, gave him a huge ration of shit for marrying this woman. And how could you do this to our mother? The poor Catholic mother, distraught over her oldest son marrying a divorced woman. And then, of course, about 7 years later, Red married a divorcee who had 2 children of her own, went on to have 4 more kids, and they're still together today, throwing stones and glass houses and all that. But anyway, my mother was tremendously anxious, isolated. I don't think she actually authentically wanted to be a mother. In fact, later in my life, she told me that. But it was just what you did in 1964. You got married and you had babies. And she only had one because the birth experience was so horrible and traumatic for her. Very similar to my own birth experience with my first child. 2 days of unproductive labor followed by a C-section. But unlike myself, who had a midwife and a doula and a supportive husband and a prenatal acupuncturist, and my best friend there with me the whole time, a virtual crowd of support, my own initiation into motherhood, one of the most transformative spiritual experiences I've ever had was the birth of my son through C-section. But my own poor mother was alone and terrified, highly medicated, in a hospital room by herself. And they kept her sedated, according to her, for a couple days. She stayed in the hospital for 3 days. And they gave her pills to dry up her milk for some reason. She felt victimized by that. And so I spent my first few days in the nursery, and because I was lifted out of my unconscious mother through the C-section, handed to a nurse, wrapped and brought to the nursery without any interaction with a living mother, my infant self believed that she was dead. And so even though I was not, I came into the world feeling abandoned. And when they finally returned me to my mother a few days later, I guess she came and looked at me through the window a few times. They wheeled her up, but she wasn't ready to hold me. When they finally brought me to her a few days later, I was enraged and felt completely betrayed that she had been there the whole time and I had thought that she was dead. And I have to say that anger at my mother persisted through most of my relationship with her until I started to do this deeper work of growing in compassion and forgiveness for her circumstances as a birthing mother. And honestly, that compassion didn't really blossom until I had children of my own, particularly my own C-section experience, which I spent pretty much the whole 9 months of my pregnancy trying to avoid. Again, I had a doula and a midwife. I wanted to home birth in a birthing tub, had it set up in my living room, did yoga 3 times a week until the day before I went into labor, drank this special midwife's tea, massaged my vagina, was doing everything. Because I was terrified I would give my son the same experience that I had had. And that if he had a C-section, that he would have trauma. And like all budding parents, I wanted my child to have a perfect life. I had not yet accepted that the challenge is part of the design and the difficulty actually makes us stronger. Just like lifting weights. If we lift weights that are easy for us, we will not grow in strength. We have to challenge ourselves, and life challenges us. And because of the complexity and variety of each individual person, the same situation for 10 different people will produce 10 different outcomes. And there was tremendous transformation in learning from my C-section, the least of not which was that the exertion of my own will not always produce the results that I desire, but generally I get what I really need. And so having my own C-section with my son forced me to move through the thing I was most terrified of, and it healed me in ways I couldn't have imagined. It brought tremendous compassion for my mother. It dissolved a lot of my fear of repetition of what had happened to me on my own children, and kind of broke me open to the deepening mystery of how things unfold in a karmic way that gives us opportunities to do it different. Thank you so much for listening. If you like this podcast, please leave me 5 stars on Spotify or a review on iTunes. Helps the show get up in the ratings so more people can find it. I'm starting a new round of spiritual experience groups, really deep, supportive, small group experiences of my work, virtually on Zoom, 4 to 6 people once a week for 6-week blocks. There's a link in the show notes with the days and times that are available coming up starting mid-April. You can shoot me an email, info@reneemckenna.com to find out more, or DM me on Instagram @Renee LaValle McKenna. Deep gratitude to my supporters on Patreon, and blessings on your path until we meet again. This is Renee LaValle McKenna for Spiritual Psychology.